Good evening and welcome. Today, major surprises among Donald Trump's latest picks to fill his cabinet, including Matt Gaetz, a fierce and loyal defender of Mr. Trump in Congress, now his choice to become the next attorney general. The bracing winds of political change blowing across Washington today, where the president-elect met with President Biden at the White House, each man pledging a smooth transition. Within hours of that meeting came the news that Republicans will claim the final prize of last week's election, control of Congress in addition to the presidency. Though votes are still being counted, NBC News can now project Republicans will keep control of the House of Representatives by a slim margin. President-elect Trump already claiming a clear mandate as he has pressed forward in laying out his cabinet choices in rapid-fire fashion. Some raising eyebrows, including a Fox News host and former soldier to lead the Pentagon, and former Democratic Congresswoman turned Trump supporter Tulsi Gabbard as Director of National Intelligence. And late today, Matt Gaetz added to head the Department of Justice. It's where we start with Peter Alexander.
Tonight, the culmination of a comeback. President-elect Trump arriving in Washington just as NBC News projected the GOP will keep its House majority. And tonight, Trump's announcing a series of new high-profile picks that have stunned even some of his allies. Among the picks, Trump defender Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz for Attorney General, that's sparking a bipartisan backlash. All of it as President Biden welcomed the president-elect to the White House, including a handshake inside the Oval Office.
Mr. President-elect and former President, thank you. Donald, congratulations.
Thank you.
After a heated campaign,
Biden was a low IQ guy 35 years ago.
Trump is a threat to this nation.
Any bitterness today was tucked away. Biden telling Trump, welcome back.
Looking forward to having like we said, a smooth transition. Do everything we can to make sure you're accommodated, what you need. And we're going to get a chance to talk about some of that today. So
good.
Welcome
thank you
back.
Very much. And thank you very much. And politics is tough. And it's, in many cases, not a very nice world, but it is a nice world today, and I appreciate it very much. A transition that's so smooth, it'll be as smooth as it can get, and I very much appreciate that, Jim.
You're welcome. Thank you all.
The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours before even landing back in Florida. Trump rolled out those new transition picks, including Gaetz, a lightning rod. Trump ally Steve Bannon telling NBC News, President Trump is going to hit the Justice Department with a blowtorch, and Matt Gaetz is that torch.
Donald Trump is unstoppable. Elect him president again, and America will be unstoppable too.
Though Gaetz has also been fiercely criticized by fellow Republicans. Trump today announcing Tulsi Gabbard to serve as Director of National Intelligence. A former Democratic Congresswoman from Hawaii and military veteran, Gabbard campaigned for Trump and recently became a Republican.
That I'm proud to stand here with you today, President Trump, and announce that I'm joining the Republican Party.
But she's faced bipartisan criticism for secretly meeting with Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad. And overnight, a surprise pick, even to some of Trump's allies. Fox News host Pete Hegseth for Defense Secretary, a Princeton and Harvard graduate and combat veteran who earned 2 Bronze Stars. Hegseth just days ago saying this about women in combat.
Because I'm straight up just saying we should not have women in combat roles. It hasn't made us more effective, hasn't made us more lethal, has made fighting more complicated.
And he's echoed Trump's argument that the Pentagon has veered away from its military focus to pursue progressive policies.
The woke stuff will be gone within a period of 24 hours, I can tell you.
Any general that was involved, general, admiral, whatever, that was involved in any of the DEI woke, it's got to go. Either you're in for war fighting, and that's it. And that's the only litmus test we care about.
But some Democrats argue he lacks the experience to lead 1.3 million active duty troops and to oversee an $800 billion budget.
The selection of this person who has very little experience in running the largest department in the federal government, serious concerns.
The president-elect also announcing billionaire Trump supporter Elon Musk and entrepreneur Vivek Ramaswamy will lead a new so-called Department of Government Efficiency.
Nobody's smarter than Elon.
It's an idea Musk originally pitched to Trump, who says the goal is to create more efficiency and less bureaucracy by providing advice and guidance from outside of government. It currently does not exist, and it's unclear how it'll be funded. though Musk has touted massive savings.
Well, I think we can do at least $2 trillion.
Yeah! Peter, that picture at the White House today, certainly one to remember. What else have you learned about that Oval Office meeting?
Lester, the White House call it cordial and substantive. President-elect Trump says that it was a really good meeting, telling the New York Post that he and President Biden spoke about the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, and that Biden shared his views and was very gracious. Lester?
Peter Alexander starting us off. Thank you. President-elect Trump's selection of Congressman Matt Gaetz for Attorney General immediately drawing strong reaction from both Republicans and Democrats. Garrett Hake is at the Capitol.
Tonight, President-elect Trump's selection of Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz for Attorney General already sending shockwaves through Washington. Trump today describing one of his strongest defenders as a, quote, deeply gifted and tenacious attorney who will end the partisan weaponization of our justice system. Many Republicans saying after Trump's decisive victory, he's entitled to the team he wants.
I like Matt a lot. I know him very well, and I'm confident that if the Senate confirms him, he would do a good job.
But he's also facing bipartisan backlash from both Democrats.
This feels like a red alert moment for democracy.
I would describe it as God-tier level trolling.
And Republicans.
Mr. Gaetz breaks things to break things, and then once he breaks it even more. And that is somebody who should not be the Attorney General of the United States.
Gaetz has built a reputation for fiercely defending the president-elect and repeatedly going after DOJ officials, including FBI Director Christopher Wray.
You preside over the FBI that has the lowest level of trust in the FBI's history.
Tonight, Gaetz texting me, quote, I'm honored by the president's trust and confidence. Trump has repeatedly attacked the legal battles he faced as political prosecutions and has had rocky relationships with his previous attorney generals, including Jeff Sessions.
And I put an attorney general that never took control of the Justice Department, Jeff Sessions.
In Gaetz, he would have an AG that, critics say, would be more willing to do his bidding. Gaetz would have to be confirmed by a Republican Senate. And one likely concern, the DOJ and FBI investigated Gaetz for possible sex trafficking, but the case ended in 2023 without any charges filed. Gaetz denied any wrongdoing. Tonight, many Republicans backing Trump's choice.
Matt Gaetz and I, there's no question that we've had our differences. They've been very public about it. I completely trust President Trump's decision-making on this one.
What do you think the selection of Matt Gaetz says about what Donald Trump thinks about the Department of Justice?
Well, I think he thinks about the Department of Justice what a lot of us think. It's gone rogue. It's gone even corrupt in many respects.
Trump also making his selection of Marco Rubio to be his Secretary of State official today. Senator Rubio should be confirmed relatively easily, but several of these other picks could face difficult confirmation battles, and we now know who will lead the charge on those battles. It's new Senate Majority Leader John Thune of South Dakota, who was elected just today. Lester?
All right, Garrett Hake, thank you. We heard the reaction on Capitol Hill to the Gaetz pick. Laura Jarrett is tracking reaction inside the Justice Department. What's being said there tonight?
Lester, the reaction has been swift and it has been, frankly, scathing. Multiple current and former Justice Department officials telling NBC News tonight this pick is, quote, insane, stunning. One telling me, quote, he is the least qualified person ever nominated for any position in the Department of Justice. Now, the concern here is twofold. One is the sex trafficking investigation that Garrett detailed there. It was ultimately closed without any charges. But if confirmed, Gaetz would be the top law enforcement officer of the very same agency that criminally investigated him for years. The other concern expressed by officials is more about how he could use the department's resources to settle scores against the president-elect's perceived political enemies. We have heard Gaetz take aim at top prosecutors in both New York and Georgia, along with special counsel Jack Smith. Lester.
And you're reporting Jack Smith may actually resign before Inauguration Day.
He ran out of time. Bottom line there, both the federal cases he's overseeing in Washington and Florida are nowhere close to a trial. They were bogged down in delays and appeals from the very outset. You combine that with the timing, that's just a reality. The Justice Department will not prosecute a sitting president. The only question now, Lester, is whether he can get a publicly released report out before the former president is inaugurated.
All right, Laura, thank you.
Tonight, the other major cabinet announcement, the president-elect naming former House Democrat and staunch supporter Tulsi Gabbard to be Director of National Intelligence. If you remember, Gabbard ran her own campaign for president back in 2020 when she ran against now President Biden for the Democratic presidential nomination. For more on all of this, Ken Delanian joins us tonight. So, Ken, first, can you walk our viewers through Gabbard's very scattered political trajectory that got her to this point?
Scattered is a good term for it, Tom. Look, she was an Iraq combat veteran and then served in Congress as a Democrat representing a district in Hawaii for a number of years, and then even ran for president in the Democratic primary in 2020 and had a moment where she really went after Kamala Harris. But even during that time, she was taking increasingly extreme positions on foreign policy, really turning more towards the America First notion of getting out of foreign wars, of not projecting power abroad. She even heavily criticized U.S. involvement in the Syria war and went and visited President Bashar al-Assad in 2017 amid much criticism of that. And then she decided, after her unsuccessful run for president, she began taking more and more conservative positions, decided she was leaving the Democratic Party, became a Republican, not only a Republican, a MAGA acolyte, and began supporting Donald Trump, and even helped him out when he went to debate Kamala Harris. So she's really come full circle.
Okay, and then, back during the 2020 Democratic primaries, there was a lot of speculation from Democrats that Gabbard was sowing heightened levels of distrust in the election process and pointed to Gabbard's alleged ties of possible involvement in this idea of a, quote, deep state, how she was running against it. Hillary Clinton even suggested Gabbard was being groomed by Russia. A lot of allegations here. An article in the New York Times cited data when it came to Gabbard being mentioned by Russian state media back in 2009. I want to quote it here. An independent analysis of the Russian news media found that RT, the Kremlin-backed news agency, mentioned Ms. Gabbard frequently for a candidate polling in single digits. Essentially, they were covering her a lot, even though she had single digits, according to data collected by the Alliance for Securing Democracy, a group that seeks to track and expose efforts by authoritarian regimes to undermine democratic elections. All right, so Ken, how serious are these allegations?
Well, look, they're very serious, but they don't prove anything. The fact that RT was highlighting her may have more to do with her beliefs than any particular connection that she has with Russia. But it's very true that her beliefs, her worldview, aligns with the kind of propaganda you see out of Russia, discrediting the United States as a world power. And in particular, she repeated essentially Russian propaganda that there were biolabs in Ukraine. That was debunked. And at that time, Mitt Romney said that she was essentially disseminating Russian propaganda. So there are a lot of concerns, and always have been, inside the intelligence community and the security community about her and the kind of views that she takes. Obviously, she's going to go through a Senate confirmation process where a lot of that can be aired out, Tom.
And Ken, before you go, just briefly, what does the director of the National Intelligence do? Remind our viewers.
Yeah, so this was created after 9/11, this department, right, to sort of knit together all the disparate intelligence agencies. And it really, how powerful that office is really depends on how much authority the president gives that person. Technically, they outrank the director of the CIA, but the CIA has many more resources. They are actually running, the CIA director is running the intelligence collectors in the field. The DNI is more of an administrative position, but generally, often the DNI is the person that gives the president their daily intelligence briefing, and that was true in the first Trump administration. So she may see the president a lot and be in the room for a lot of very significant discussions, and she has access to the nation's secrets, Tom.
All right, Ken Delany first. Ken, we appreciate you. And tonight there are new questions about that breaking news we brought you last night about President-elect Trump's pick to lead the Defense Department. Fox News host Peter Hagel is a veteran of the Army National Guard with combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. He also served in Guantanamo Bay. He is the recipient of 2 Bronze Stars, but the 44-year-old host of Fox and Friends Weekend is largely untested on the world stage when it comes to managing an entity as large as the DoD. And remarks he's made about women in combat are getting fresh scrutiny. I want to bring in our senior national security correspondent, Courtney Cubie, with her new reporting. So, Courtney, your sources are at the Pentagon. What are they telling you about this nomination?
I think in one word, surprise. There was a tremendous amount of surprise that he was selected for this job by President-elect Donald Trump. In fact, there were a number of other names that were swirling around. And, Tom, the real reason for that surprise is pretty much what you just went through. It's the fact that he doesn't have the same qualifications and experience that most previous secretaries of defense have had. Now, in recent years, including under President Trump's first term, we saw at least one secretary of defense who was a 4-star general, retired retired four-star general. We have one currently, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. But that's the anomaly. With the exception of those two and others further back in the past, most of the secretaries of defense come in with a tremendous amount of leadership in and experience in leading a large bureaucratic institution. This Pentagon is an $800+ billion budget. There's more than 2.5 million people, active Guard, Reserve, and DoD civilians. It's an enormous bureaucracy. Pete Hegseth, as you mentioned, he's a Fox News media personality. He did serve in the National Guard for a number of different states, did these combat deployments, served for just under 20 years, but he never attained a very senior rank. His most senior rank was major, so he wasn't really leading troops during his time in the Guard. It's a very unusual decision, unusual announcement here, and I will say it has been met with a lot of surprise and, candidly, a lot of skepticism, Tom.
Yeah, he's made some remarks on a podcast recently about women's ability to serve in combat roles. Let's take a listen.
I'm straight up just saying we should not have women in combat roles. It hasn't made us more effective, hasn't made us more lethal, has made fighting more complicated. We've all served with women, and they're great. It just, our institutions don't have to incentivize that in places where not traditionally, over human history, men in those positions are more capable.
So, Courtney, there's probably people at the Pentagon who agree with him. There's probably a lot of people who don't agree with him. But he's now he may become the face of the Department of Defense, where a lot of women serve bravely, especially in combat roles. What happens now?
Yeah, women have been allowed to serve in combat roles since 2016. And since then, Tom, I have to say they have served in some of the most elite, most difficult, and most dangerous combat roles with tremendous success. So this is a policy that has proven over the last nearly decade to be a successful one. The big question now, and I will say it is a concern among many Pentagon officials who I've spoken with over the last 23 hours or so, is will Pete Hegseth, if he comes in as Secretary of Defense, try to do something to change those rules, to restrict women from serving in combat roles? And it's not just the impact that would have on combat, it's the impact that it could have on women in general in uniform. There's a recruiting problem, a recruiting crisis that's been ongoing for a number of years. How could that impact women wanting to come in and serve in the military? And it's not just that. There's the concern that it could have a real chilling effect on the women already serving in uniform if they look up and see that the most senior person leading the Department of Defense in the civilian capacity may devalue them or not see them as being as strong or tough or capable as their male counterparts. I got to tell you, Tom, there's a lot of concern about his very clear views on this issue.
And then, Courtney, I'm going to kind of put you on the spot here. So besides, what's happening in Ukraine, besides what's happening in the Middle East, in Gaza and Lebanon, what do you think are the two most pressing issues the Defense Secretary is going to face in 2025?
Yeah, so those are two obvious ones. I will say there is the continuing problem from these Iranian-backed militia groups. They are attacking U.S. service members and allies in Iraq and Syria all the time still. It's not getting a lot of attention because the majority are not successful. The Houthis in Yemen, they are firing off every single day. But it's not just that, Tom. Think about this term, 2027. That is the date that President Xi Jinping of China has set for his military to be prepared for an invasion of Taiwan. Doesn't mean it's going to happen then, but that is when he has told them to be ready. That will be during this term. That is something people should be watching.
Okay. Courtney Kube first. Courtney, we thank you for that. We want to get over to Capitol Hill now, where we have more breaking news tonight. House Speaker Mike Johnson confirming Matt Gaetz has just resigned his seat in Congress in the wake of his nomination for Attorney General. I want to get right to NBC News congressional correspondent Julie Sirkin for more on this. Julie, Gaetz is resigning his seat before being confirmed as AG, and that confirmation is not a sure thing. I want to play a bit more of the reaction you and your team have gotten from lawmakers on both sides. Let's take a listen.
I mean, this feels like a red alert moment for democracy. Matt Gaetz has said we should abolish the FBI, the ATF, if it doesn't get in line with conservative political priorities. This is somebody who is very clearly being put in this position to do whatever Donald Trump says and to fold the DOJ into the White House.
I don't think it's a serious nomination for the Attorney General. We need to have a serious Attorney General, and I'm looking forward to the opportunity to consider somebody that is serious. This one This one was not on my bingo card.
The one thing about Matt that concerns me a little bit is I didn't like the way he handled the squabble with Speaker McCarthy. I think it was. I thought it was unnecessary. I thought it was divisive. I think that the conference suffered.
So, Julie, what's new is that for the first time, I'd say in a few weeks, we're hearing Republicans openly speaking out against something that President-elect Trump is doing. Is this what you're hearing across Congress?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the first reactions coming in were OMG, WTF. I mean, every acronym in that direction that you can think of. Senators across the ideological spectrum among Republicans, not just like the moderates that Murkowski and Collins often find themselves in, but also people in MAGA world, conservatives who are elected sitting members of Congress who just don't like Matt Gaetz, frankly think the investigations into him are problematic. You've heard our guests lay that out so well already, think that his shenanigans with McCarthy are problematic, as you heard Kevin Cramer say there, and think that this is just an individual who is unserious, in the words of Murkowski, to lead an agency as big as the Department of Justice, given everywhere that agency has their hands in. And it's going to be a long road for Gaetz and a big test for Senate Republicans who, for the first time, it's been check notes 7 days, 8 days since Trump was announced the president-elect, have to see if they want to stand up to him.
Yeah. You know, I also want to go to that other major news, right? NBC News projecting that Republicans will have control of the House of Representatives when the new Congress takes their seats in January. This, of course, means Trump and the Republicans will control all of Washington with GOP majorities in both houses of Congress and Republican taking the White House. But, you know, it's still unclear the exact size of that House majority, and that will matter for certain things. I know there's been some developing news, as we mentioned at the top of the show, about Speaker Mike Johnson.
Yeah, there has been, and that is that Speaker Mike Johnson announced a couple of minutes before your show, Tom, that actually Matt Gaetz has offered his resignation from Congress effective immediately. Republicans seem to think that that'll give him an easier time of replacing Gaetz' seat in very red Florida, giving them more of a window to make that happen because, as you saw on your screen, House control has been called for Republicans. There are still several seats that have been uncalled. So far, Republicans are right at that 218 number. That's what gives them the majority, but that doesn't give them a guarantee that they'll be able to enforce and actually put on the floor everything the President-elect Trump wants to do. So definitely some consternation and worries. Steve Scalise's first reaction to Gaetz was stop taking our guys.
And we don't think that there's going to be sort of an incursion from maybe far-right Republicans against Mike Johnson anymore?
No, and it's because President-elect Trump went behind closed doors with House Republicans this morning. Sources told me that he could not have been more positive and complimentary of Mike Johnson. He said he's done a tremendous job. He called him terrific, according to one lawmaker in the room. That pretty much puts to bed any potential challenge that Johnson can face. And look, he's put in a lot of work. This is somebody who's risen, who nobody really knew when he got the gavel in the first place. He's visited Mar-a-Lago several times. He has plans to go there again later this week. He's tried to be in Trump's good graces through all of this, and Trump has protected him before when Marjorie Taylor Greene and other conservatives in the MAGA movement have tried to oust Johnson. Now that gavel all but guaranteed with that Republican leadership slate reelected today and new members elected down below.
Yeah, and before you go, I do want to move over to the Senate. We know that Thune is now going to be the majority leader, Senator Thune from South Dakota. It's interesting here, right, because the vote, it was a secret ballot, so Republican senators didn't essentially have to say who they voted for. And I say it's interesting because, you know, Thune wasn't necessarily the MAGA world pick, if you will. It seemed like Rick Scott was more that many in the MAGA world wanted to pick, but Thune comes out on top. What does that mean?
Yeah, Scott was out after the first round of voting. Just 13 people voted for him, 3 more than 2 years ago when he unsuccessfully challenged McConnell. What it says is that the MAGA universe on X or on social media doesn't necessarily reflect in elected members of Congress, especially among senators who really hate to be pressured to do anything. This isn't House Republicans. This is Senate Republicans. They see their role differently. They see themselves as a deliberative body. So John Thune being elected today was by and large not a shock or surprise to many here on Capitol Hill, but certainly certainly an affirmation, or reaffirmation, I should say, of MAGA world's waning powers, perhaps, and influence on Senate Republicans, at least.
Yeah, we're going to have to wait and see. That could change back. All right, Julie Sirkin, we thank you so much for that. Trump also confirmed today the appointment of Republican Florida Senator Marco Rubio to the position of Secretary of State, something NBC News had reported earlier this week. Rubio, who is known for his aggressive approach to foreign policy, will be the first Latino to serve in that position. For more on this decision and what we can expect Rubio to focus on, NBC News senior White House correspondent Gabe Gutierrez has more from the White House, of course. Gabe, Senator Rubio is known to be hawkish when it comes to Russia and China. How do we think it will impact his role in the Trump administration?
Well, hey there, Tom. The Rubio pick could potentially signal a more confrontational stance with Beijing. You know, both he and Trump's pick for national security advisor have been backers of a tough China policy, and that could prove a little different for Trump, who, as you know, Tom, can be very transactional. In his first term, Trump lifted sanctions on a major Chinese telecom manufacturer in exchange for progress on a trade deal. Still, Trump has been touting his support for tariffs now against China. So this more hawkish stance could be exactly what he's looking for, Tom.
Do we know about his stances on what's happening in Gaza and Lebanon?
Yes, we do. Rubio serves on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Tom, and he's been very outspoken about the Israel-Hamas war and his support of Israel. And he said that Israel has no choice but to seek the complete eradication of Hamas in Gaza. And his view is that it's the U.S.'s role to resupply Israel with the military materials needed to finish the job. And, you know, we just heard today from families of Israeli hostages right here at the White House that they've already spoken to Rubio's senior staff about the ongoing ceasefire talks, Tom.
Okay, and then, Gabe, I want to play some video of Senator Rubio and President-elect Trump on their views of TikTok, an app used by millions of Americans every day, the biggest app in the world right now. Let's take a listen.
I want to ban TikTok for a very simple reason. They allow the Chinese Communist Party to gain access to all of the private data on any device in America that's using TikTok. That's our kids, that's phones connected to our kids' phones, and that's a national security threat.
But we're going to make our country greater than ever before, and I appreciate all your support.
Thank you, and you'll never ban TikTok, that's for sure.
I will never ban TikTok.
Thank you.
Look, this may not be the most pressing foreign policy issue, obviously, but it's a clear break between the Secretary of State, who still needs to be confirmed, and the president-elect.
Well, a break at this point. It's one of the unanswered questions right now. And TikTok does face a January deadline to find a new owner not based in China or lose access to U.S. users. That's under a law passed in April with bipartisan support. Now, Trump, as you just heard during the campaign, he supported saving the app, and it's unclear whether Rubio will change his mind. But, Tom, he didn't get to this position by contradicting Trump.
Yeah, exactly. It's a good point. Gabe, before you go, this was sort of a moment, right? But there's been so much news, and I wanted to come back to it. And it was President-elect Trump at the White House with President Biden, something we didn't see 4 years ago. Talk to us about how this meeting came about and if there were any reporters in the room, because I don't think any questions were asked, right?
Well, Tom, it's incredible you mentioned that because, yes, it happened just a few hours ago. It feels like it happened at least yesterday. Look, there were no reporters in the room for most of the meeting. The White House called it a substantive and cordial meeting, and President-elect Trump says it was a really good meeting, telling the New York Post that he and President Biden spoke about the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, and that Biden shared his views and was very gracious. Now, both of their chiefs of staff were in the room, and of course, Tom, this comes just days after a brutal campaign where both Biden and Trump referred to each other as threats to democracy. None of that here today, both wanting to project the image of a peaceful transfer of power. Biden even telling Trump, welcome back. And again, the meeting just lasted just shy of 2 hours.
Gabe Gutierrez, pretty incredible to watch those photos of them shaking hands there in the White House. Okay, Gabe, we thank you for that.
Joining me now is Ambassador John Bolton, former national security advisor to Donald Trump in his first term. He's also served as U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. Ambassador Bolton, thank you so much for being here on a big day.
It is a big day.
It's a big day.
Not a good day, but a big day.
It's a big day. Let me get your reaction to this latest breaking news, the fact that President-elect Trump intends to nominate Matt Gaetz to run the Department of Justice. What was your immediate reaction when you heard that?
Well, it must be the worst nomination for a cabinet position in American history. I think this is something that falls well outside the scope of deference that should be given to a president in nominating members of his senior team. Gaetz is not only totally incompetent for this job, he doesn't have the character. He is a person of moral turpitude. And notwithstanding how difficult it may be politically, this is a nomination the Republican Party should oppose.
You're saying he's the worst. That's pretty strong language, the worst ever. Do you think the Republican Party will oppose him, though, even those who are saying that they're shocked today?
Well, I think a lot of people are going to be intimidated by Trump. This is the way he governs, and I think it may never come to a vote on the floor. If the new leadership in the Senate goes to the president and says, you cannot endanger Republican senators by forcing them to vote in favor of this nomination. And if you don't want to have a real internal party battle, this nomination needs to be withdrawn.
Do you think that Gaetz is and we'll tick through some of the other nominees, but do you think he's the only one that you might see some real opposition to, or do you think there are others?
Well, I think that Tulsi Gabbard's nomination to be Director of National Intelligence, when I first heard that today, my immediate reaction was hilarious.
Why?
She's totally not competent for that job. Gaetz is the worst. She may be tracking in at the second worst. Haven't had a lot of time to do research on the Tulsi Gabbard nomination, but let me bring you to January the 8th, 2020, congressional briefing after President Trump's correct decision to eliminate Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Iranian Quds Force. Tulsi Gabbard said in an interview with Jake Tapper, that the briefers who described the reasons for the elimination of Qasem Soleimani and how it carried out, she said they provided vague comments, no justification whatsoever for this illegal and unconstitutional act of war that President Trump took. So now is she prepared to obey the orders of a man who committed an illegal and unconstitutional act of war as Director of National Intelligence? Is that the kind of person Donald Trump wants to head that important function? I've believed for a long time that ODNI should be abolished, and now there's another reason to abolish it.
Well, and undoubtedly that will come up during her confirmation hearings. There's no doubt about that quote that you just read, which is incredibly striking to hear it. Let me ask you about Pete Hegseth. He obviously also came as a surprise to some people because he, yes, has a military background, but is a Fox News host. Did you see that one coming? And is that someone who you would support?
Well, I don't put Hegseth in the same category as Matt Gaetz and Tulsi Gabbard. I think the purpose of the confirmation process is to find out whether he's qualified. I used to do a lot of stuff on Fox News, too. I don't think that disqualifies me. Hegseth went to Princeton University. It's not Yale, where I went, but it's not a bad little college. He served with honor and bravery in the military. And people say he was only a captain. Chuck Hagel was an enlisted man. So was I in the National Guard. So being a captain is government experience. Can he handle the job? It depends in part on who he has around him. And, you know, he said a number of things that have come out in the past a day or so, saying he'd fire the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I think that's a clear mistake.
Why?
Because I think that is the kind of politicization of the military that we've striven throughout our history, and I think been very successful in keeping the military non-political. There are complaints about what Biden's policy did to the Department of Defense, and if it's to clean up the politicization that Trump wants to act, I think that's fine. I don't think you want to compound the error by going through a purge of generals that you think are unsatisfactory.
Do you anticipate that there will be a purge, as your language, of sorts, both in the DOJ and at the Pentagon?
Look, the president has and should have freedom to get the kind of people in place that he wants in government. Article 2 is very clear about where the executive power lies. It lies with the president. The question is whether it's prudent and sensible to do some of the things they've been talking about. If you get Matt Gaetz as the Attorney General, I'd like to see what lawyers are prepared to work for him. And I'd like to see what their reaction is when he starts ordering prosecutions, as Trump wanted John Kerry prosecuted in his first term for violation of the Logan Act. How much of that are we going to see? Is Matt Gaetz going to prosecute Liz Cheney and Mark Milley? Are there attorneys in the department who, on the basis of no evidence whatever, they've committed any criminal conduct? Are they really going to convene a grand jury? This is the kind of crisis that you're going to see, I think, in these two departments, defense and justice in particular, where the flashpoints will be in the second Trump term.
Do you have any concerns? You've obviously been critical of President-elect Trump after he left office.
You know, look, he's got a long list of people to seek retribution against. I don't know where I am on the hit parade these days, but this is something we should stand against. You don't prosecute your political opponents for disagreeing with you.
Let me ask you about Marco Rubio in the context of an issue you and I talk about quite a lot, which is Ukraine. How do you see if he is, in fact, confirmed to be the next Secretary of State? He has been supportive of funding, but it said it's also time to wind this war down. How do you think he would impact those foreign conflicts?
Well, what I hope he will do, and I hope Mike Waltz will do the same, who's also modified his position on Ukraine, they are now no longer in the position of giving political speeches.
Yeah.
They now have to do strategic analysis of what's in the best interest of the United States. And given the circumstances and given the negative effect of a Russian victory or what's seen as a Russian victory in Ukraine, that point has to be made. Here's one important point they should make. It's not just a Russian victory, it's the impact it has on China. The principal threat the United States faces. If we don't stand up to aggression on the continent of Europe, are we going to stand up to it in Asia?
Well, so you take me to my next question, because obviously Marco Rubio is a hawk when it comes to China. Do you think that that is a strong nomination?
Look, I think it's the best you can expect from the Trump administration, and I think I have a lot of respect for Marco Rubio. I wish he was stronger on Ukraine. Nobody agrees with anybody 100%. I'd say pretty nearly the same thing about Mike Waltz. I don't want to do him any damage with Trump. I probably should say I'll be for him or against him, whichever will help them more. But I think these are two strong nominations.
Do you think that President-elect Trump, who's going to take the oath of office in just a matter of months, do you think he will adhere to the oath?
I don't know. I honestly don't know. I don't think he understands oaths. I don't think he understands what the responsibilities of the presidency are. It's why I thought he was not fit to be reelected.
All right. Ambassador John Bolton, as always, we really appreciate your perspective. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Great to see you.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.